On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I'm Andrew Becker, your moderator for the evening. It's my pleasure to introduce our evening's guest. Chris Woods is an investigative journalist who specializes in conflict and national security issues. Former senior BBC Panorama producer, he has authored several investigations into covert U.S. drone strikes and their true effects. He's also the author of the recent book, Sudden Justice, America's Secret Drone Wars, the timing of which is excellent. Woods was awarded the Martha Gellhorn Journalism Prize in 2013 for his work investigating the Obama administration's drone wars and their consequences for civilians. Please join me in welcoming Chris Woods for a conversation about the use of drones in America's counterterrorism operations and the secrecy that often surrounds these missions. So, Chris, before we really get into where we are, how we got to where we are in the U.S. secret drone war, including the roots of remotely piloted aircraft and the weaponization of those platforms, I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about where we are right now. It's really been kind of an extraordinary few weeks in terms of news revelations, developments about the U.S. drone war, and particularly really kind of a highly unusual, unbelievable mea culpa from the White House recently about some drone strikes that took place back in January. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Andrew. It's been a remarkable few weeks, not just for the fact that the president stood up and admitted that the CIA had accidentally killed a civilian, Warren Weinstein, but I think for the revelations that have come out around that. The secret drone wars, the targeted killings have been going on for 13 years now. Carried out by the CIA, but they go through these periods where they simply disappear from the public's daily life, and we hadn't really heard much about the killings for a while. Suddenly, for the president to have a press conference to stand up and say, we've accidentally killed an American, we've killed 2 other Americans as well, that was shocking enough, and I think that was, by the way, a pretty devastating blow to the CIA. I think the reason the president had to stand up and admit that was because it was so damaging reputationally to the CIA, which had built so much of its claims around its drone strikes about accuracy and precision. And then it turns out that in that particular case, they'd been watching that building for weeks and simply didn't know who was inside. But from that event, we've actually had a whole spate of fairly detailed revelations coming out of publications like the New York Times, like the Wall Street Journal, which have given us much more detail than we've had before now on the drone program. So, for example, the New York Times decided to out the 3 key characters in the CIA's drone campaign, even though they were all officers whose identities had previously been hidden. The Wall Street Journal revealed that when President Obama announced new rules for drone strikes in Pakistan back in 2013, they had actually secretly exempted the CIA from some of those same rules. They just never got round to telling us. So we're in one of those intermittent periods when we're getting a lot of information about the drone strike. There's currently a lot of pressure, for example, for the CIA's strikes to be taken off the agency and given to the Pentagon. How this is going to resolve is not particularly clear. I suspect when it settles down, it will be mostly business as usual. But for the time being, I think this is an interesting period.
I mean, it's renewed the debate about the use of drones, primarily off of the hot battlefield. But part of that also comes with a renewed debate about accountability, about transparency, and certainly in light of the Senate report on torture, that the enhanced interrogation, as it's called, by the CIA. It's interesting that there is also some throughput here from the people in the CIA, some of whom have been outed, had involvement both in that program as well as the drone program. But they've also, or one in particular, has also done a pretty good job at cultivating Congress, and particularly Dianne Feinstein and others on the Senate Intelligence Committee. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that as well in terms of real congressional oversight and what that, or when what it really looks like?
I mean, congressional oversight is something that was introduced only, I think, 8 years into the targeted killing program, into the assassination program, by Senator Feinstein when she was chairing the Senate Intelligence Committee. And I think certainly on paper it's a good thing. Under the new rules, once a month, staffers, members of the Senate and House Intelligence Committees, they'll go down to the CIA, they'll be shown selected videos of drone strikes, they'll be talked through certain operations. On paper, it looks good. I think the reality of oversight, though, unfortunately, is it's cheerleading masquerading as oversight. What we've actually seen, there was a story in the New York Times a few weeks ago about the Obama administration considering assassinating an American. As it turned out, this individual was eventually arrested by the Pakistan government and is now awaiting trial in New York, and something to ponder there. The CIA and Department of Defense were both pushing aggressively for his assassination. The Department of Justice, we're told, was digging in. Where the oversight committees kicked in on that case, they didn't take the CIA to task for considering killing this American. They took the CIA to task for not having killed him yet. And I thought that was remarkable. I thought that the idea of an oversight committee should have some independence, should have the ability to take on the CIA when necessary. There was another occasion when Dianne Feinstein a few years ago said that to the best of her understanding, she'd done her utmost to discover that the CIA was only killing civilians in the single digits every year. And I followed through on that, and I contacted every single NGO that had conducted field work in Pakistan into civilian deaths, and I contacted every international news agency that had done field studies into civilian deaths. Not a single one had been contacted by any member or staffer of either Senate Intelligence Committee. So oversight is an insular affair. It's an inward-looking business that is really as much about protecting the reputational damage of the CIA, in my view, as taking them to task. And interestingly, I don't think it need be this way, and I don't think the CIA ever thought it would be that way. For the book, I asked a former high-ranking CIA official what happened before formal oversight. What did the CIA do before you had to tell the Senate and House Intelligence Committees what you were doing? And he said, well, it wasn't formal, but if we had a big operation, we would pick up the phone and we would call the head of the Senate Intelligence Committee and we would chat them through an operation. And I said, well, that sounds very informal. He said, well, don't believe for a minute that was all there was to it. Of course, we kept a very clear paper trail of everything we were doing. And what they anticipated is, just as the Congress had come for the CIA over torture, they thought that at some point Congress would come for them on the drone strikes. And they anticipated that would probably happen around the change of government in 2008, 2009. Of course, the reality was Obama didn't turn on the drone strikes, he embraced them. And in fact, Obama has bombed 8 or 9 times more in Pakistan than Bush, for example. He expanded the secret wars to Yemen and to Somalia. So even the CIA, I think, expected oversight to be tougher than it turned out to be.
I mean, so we really are in this age of drones. I mean, it is really a key element of modern U.S. warfare. Certainly, in some of the things you've reported and described in the past, I mean, there are more of the drone pilots being trained right now than there are fighter or bomber pilots being combined and being trained combined. That really, this is the face of future warfare for the United States. I'm wondering if you can give us a little sense of what that looks like. And part of that is a lot of your focus has been on the CIA, but in the CIA program. But we're actually, when it comes to drones, we're talking about programs. It's not just a CIA program.
That's absolutely right. And one of the things I wanted to do with the book, my focus as a journalist for a long time had been on the covert clandestine use of drones. And I realized that actually I knew virtually nothing about how they were being used on the regular battlefield. And it's one of the things I've really tried to address in the book, speaking to operators, analysts, intelligence chiefs, and so on. And the book is really the voices of really hundreds of people involved in the drone program, in their words rather than mine. We've got 3 drone programs, really. One is the CIA's, which is the one that captures all the headlines. There's a second drone program, which is run by American Special Forces. They predominantly carry out strikes on behalf of Joint Special Operations Command. The fascinating thing for me about those strikes was that it turned out JSOC never really killed with its drones until 2011, until Obama ordered JSOC's drones into Yemen and Somalia. The primary focus of JSOC's drones in places like Iraq and Afghanistan was intelligence gathering. And time again, I was told by former Special Forces drone operators, they used to take the missiles off their drones to give them more capability to keep the drones in the air for longer so that they could gather more intelligence. Now, I'm sure many of you will have seen Jeremy Scahill's film Dirty Wars. On the ground, there was quite a lot of JSOC killing going on, but from the air, their drones were very rarely kinetic. And if you think back to when the US was trying to kill Anwar al-Awlaki in 2010, 2011, there was a lot of fighting between the CIA and Special Forces, partly because Special Forces kept botching the killing of al-Awlaki. And I think one of the reasons for that is they just weren't very good at killing. They were good at intelligence gathering with their drones. They weren't very good at killing. Now, the third aspect of the armed drone use, which is the least controversial, I think, but actually probably the most revolutionary in terms of warfare, is on the conventional battlefield. 80% of drone strikes are taking place in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, run by regular Air Force personnel, covered by the laws of war, under full military control. And there's been a really profound shift in the way that we fight wars. Partly because of the role that drones fulfill on the battlefield, protecting troops, going ahead, looking out for improvised explosive devices, giving 24/7 surveillance, partly in their ability to deliver precise munitions very close into troops when they're in contact and so on. So you have these 3 campaigns, the bulk of which are not controversial in my view, each quite tightly meshed with each other. Where things get complicated is that they're all technically owned by the Air Force, all of these drones. And we've found, unfortunately, that the Pentagon is so concerned about unraveling the secret side of the campaign that they won't give us information even about the regular use of armed drones on the battlefield, which I think they should be doing, actually. I think the British, for example, tell us who they bomb, where they bomb, how many civilians they kill. That is information the American public is presently denied from regular battlefields, and I don't think that should be the case.
I mean, that is an interesting point. I mean, juxtaposed with, say, the Vietnam War, where U.S. forces dropped 4.7 million tons of ordnance, causing 100,000 plus civilian deaths. In comparison, the numbers are much greater. I mean, the precision that these weapons are able to kill with is extraordinary. What's the sense? I mean, it's 3,000 plus deaths that have occurred at.
I mean, the difference between aerial warfare has historically been one of the most indiscriminate forms of war that we have. Civilians die in aerial warfare, usually more than any other way we have of killing on the battlefield. And that's because the munitions that we drop are dumb, generally, or historically have been dumb, and we tend to drop them in large numbers to achieve what we want to. Since the 1970s, technology has started to shift how we bomb from the air, and the weapons and the aircraft firing them have got smarter and smarter. So what we found is, instead of the carpet bombing that we had in Laos and Cambodia in the 60s that, as Andrew says, killed more than 100,000 civilians, in Pakistan, Yemen and Somalia over a similar time period, as far as I can work out, no more than about 350 tons of explosives dropped and about 500 civilians killed. Now, that's still very worrying, but the shift in the risk to civilians on the battlefield is fairly profound. But I think the problem we have with drones is, while they do represent this major technological breakthrough, it doesn't really matter unless you have the political will to reduce civilian casualties. If you put a big bomb on a drone, it's going to kill civilians. And sometimes we do use big bombs on drones. It's also where you bomb, and I talk about Israel and its use of armed drones on the battlefield. So, for example, Israel will routinely bomb heavily developed urban areas, for example, Gaza, where the risk of civilian casualties is much higher. So the technological advantages of drones need to be coupled with a political will to reduce those civilian casualties, in my view.
But really, we have not seen that. Have you, in your view, have we seen that political will? I mean, part of it has been interference or really a dismissal of efforts to tally civilian deaths.
I think there has been that political will. I think the CIA was indifferent to civilian deaths for a long time in Pakistan. What was happening in Afghanistan is every time ISAF or the US killed civilians in Afghanistan, the president, Hamid Karzai, would pick up the phone and start shouting, "Stop killing my civilians." The problem we had over the border in Pakistan, which was effectively the same war, was that the Pakistan government was colluding with the CIA in the killing of its citizens. So there was nobody to pick up the phone. There was no pressure to reduce those civilian deaths. And what we saw over a long period was a lot of civilians killed. And there's a couple of quite shocking instances I talk through in the book. And also my own investigations over the years. A few years back, I showed that the CIA was deliberately targeting first responders in Pakistan, for example. It would bomb, wait for rescuers to come to the scene, come back and bomb the rescuers. It bombed funerals on occasion. This is absolutely shocking behavior that when you talk to US military folk about that, they say that we would never do that. This is somewhere we would never go.
I mean, those sound like tactics we've heard of happening in Iraq and in other locations when it comes to car bombs or terrorist activity.
Yeah, and they have been labelled as potential war crimes by 2 UN investigators, and they've been investigated on those terms. That UN investigation is presently stalled because the US won't cooperate any further with that investigation, particularly looking into the specifics, for example, of those rescue strikes. But we are in potential war crime territory here. And how did the CIA let itself get into that situation? How did this gulf occur on the battlefield where we're bombing under the laws of war in Afghanistan, but over the border in Pakistan, we're doing things that we simply shouldn't be? And I think it keeps coming back time and time again. Why has a civilian intelligence agency with no accountability got its own air force? And that's the problem.
And much of that, and just to touch on that for a second, I mean, it really veers into issues with geopolitics. I mean, in terms of a plausible deniability for the Pakistan government, in terms of rooting out potential terrorists or suspected terrorists in their country or in some of the tribal areas between Pakistan on the western Pakistan border. And that's part of the debate about Pentagon having ultimate control over the drone program versus the CIA. Can you just flesh that out a little bit?
It's a very sensitive one. It comes back, I think, to the legality. So 200 nations, roughly, on the planet, 198 of them think that drone strikes off the hot battlefield are unlawful. Israel is it has an ambivalent position. Pretty much the US is out there on its own. That's not me saying that. When I spoke to a very high-ranking former US official with deep knowledge of the drone program, if I can put it that way, they said, we are the only country on earth who believe we have the right to take this war to any country we want outside of hot battles. And that same official told me that some of America's closest allies sometimes won't share intelligence if it might lead to the death of their citizens at the hands of the CIA because they view the strikes as unlawful. So the problem we have when people talk about the Pentagon having control of these strikes, the strikes being transferred from CIA to the Pentagon, one of the reasons the CIA carries out these strikes is because there is this view, held even within the intelligence community, that they're probably unlawful. So when you've suddenly got military personnel being given those strikes, then you're potentially into problem areas. Actually, the military already fly the CIA's drones. Last year I revealed that the 17th Reconnaissance Squadron, as it's named, which is the CIA's own drone squadron flown out of Creech Air Force Base, is regular Air Force personnel. So there are these contradictions already, but there are lots of sensitivities around the military flying these operations. And I don't think they're going to go away. I think they're there to stay.
But with that, in the two countries, Israel and the United States, the Israeli ambivalence, and yet they've still have essentially gone through a legal vetting of sorts to get to the point where they feel they are justified, legally justified in using that kind of force.
It was really interesting for me so I looked at how the US and Israeli targeted killing programs had evolved round about the same time. Israel started a formal assassination program round about late 2000, early 2001, during the Second Intifada, the second uprising by the Palestinians. I got some very helpful engagement by former senior Israel Defense Force lawyers who talked me through how the whole thing worked. Early on, they simply began the program without really engaging the lawyers, and in fact one of them told me that there were about 5 or 6 kills in before his general came to him and said, "Is it legal?" Which I thought was interesting. But from that point on, the Israelis then decided to push their targeted killing program through the court system, steered by the IDF, and it was pushed all the way to the Israeli Supreme Court. They asked for a ruling from the Israeli Supreme Court, is it lawful? And the Israeli Supreme Court said it's neither lawful nor unlawful. For the US, as we know, the Department of Justice has blocked the engagement on this question of legality by federal courts at every possible opportunity. So there is no chance for US citizens to know whether these strikes are lawful. You are simply told they are lawful. And in fact, I was speaking with the ACLU last week, and they told me of the 11 legal memos we know of relating to the legality of the drone strikes. 8 of them are still being blocked from public release. So that's the challenge. We had the Israeli position is as far as they're concerned, and the Supreme Court says these are lawful. The US position is this is an executive issue only. This is not for the courts. The courts are not to get involved in this. And that continues to create tensions, not just with advocacy groups like ACLU, but with the courts themselves. And a number of federal judges have complained about being blocked from engaging on the issue.
So it sounds as if even obviously within the government, in terms of there's plenty of debate on the legal and the political and the policy of it as well, in terms of who is going to run these programs. How about in terms of the effect of the intended and the unintended consequences or outcome? The idea that while there might be tactical victories here, what are the strategic results?
I mean, there is no doubt that the drones are very effective at targeting America's enemies. If you look at Pakistan, if you look what the drones have achieved, they have decimated Al-Qaeda and some of the Taliban and associated groups there. They didn't just decimate their ranks, they also forced them to change their behavior. So immediately after 9/11, these were still fairly high-tech groups. They were still using the web. They were still, plotting and connected all over the world. All of that changed when the drones followed them into Waziristan, an area where previously militant and terrorist groups and the CIA, when it was fighting the Russians, have been able to hide out because you couldn't get at them. And suddenly there wasn't a no-go area on the planet for these terrorists and militants. They had to change the way they operated. It slowed everything down. It interrupted their ability to launch terrorist attacks. And if you think about it, there were some major attacks launched by Al-Qaeda after 9/11, for example, the Madrid train bombing, the London bombings, and so on. But the attacks grew fewer and fewer until effectively Al-Qaeda in Pakistan was destroyed. And that's the current situation. You can say that the armed drones significantly contributed to that. The problem, I think, for the drones is we don't know, in terms of around that, how much effect they've actually had. The Taliban has barely been affected by the drone strikes. And in fact, at the moment in Afghanistan, we're seeing one of the most intense periods of Taliban activity ever. And from about 2008, most of the drone strikes carried out by the US and Pakistan were really related to the counterinsurgency across the border in Afghanistan. They were smuggled in under the guise of the CIA's anti-Al-Qaeda war. And then we look at places like Yemen and Somalia, where Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab go from strength to strength. And there is a concern among many people within the intelligence and military communities that what the United States is presently doing is what Robert Grenier, the former head of the CIA's Counterterrorism Center, called mowing the grass. You are simply culling a certain number of terrorists, but that's all you're really achieving anymore. And there's also the loss of the ability to control for who replaces the leaders that you kill. And one of the worst examples of that was when the CIA killed the Pakistan Taliban's commander, a guy called Baitullah Masood, in 2009. The man who replaced him, Hakimullah Masood, was 10 times worse. He was a vicious, vicious terrorist who expanded the Taliban's campaign, not just against the Pakistan military and against US forces across the border, but also against Pakistan's civilian population. And the current estimates are that Pakistan has lost around 30,000 citizens since 9/11 in its war on terror against that terrorist group. So we can't really control for the outcomes of what we're doing. And then there's the even bigger strategic picture when you look at a country like Yemen and say, well, what have we achieved in the 4 years of drone strikes against al-Qaeda in Yemen? According to the State Department's own figures, al-Qaeda is 10 times stronger in Yemen today than it was when we started. And I think also the focus almost exclusively by the administration on counterterrorism issues in Yemen really didn't deal with the stuff on the sides, the nation building, the working with the local government, the propping up the bits of Yemen we needed to work, because the focus was almost always on counterterrorism, counterterrorism, counterterrorism. And I think that is a problem. And when Obama stood up last year and announced that US drone strikes and airstrikes were going to take place in Iraq and Syria against Islamic State, he described Yemen as the model for that operation. Well, 6 months later, Yemen is a basket case. The US embassy is closed, special forces have pulled out, half the drone fleets had to go north anyway. And there is a 3 or even 4-way civil war there, which is now drawing in Iran and Saudi Arabia because of the war they seem determined to fight with each other. You can't pin that on the drones at all. But what you can say is that the stuff that should go with the drone strikes, if you're going to have that policy, just isn't there a lot of the time. Cameron Munter, the former US ambassador to Pakistan, spoke to me for the book. And he described how, on occasion, the CIA ran the show in Pakistan. You know, his strategic role to enhance America's long-term interests in that country, he felt were routinely undermined by the CIA basically ignoring him or just ignoring his wishes. So tactically, yes, the drones can be very successful. Strategically, I think we too often don't know what we're actually doing with them.
So to step back, way back for a second, to get an understanding of how we got to where we are, describe a little bit about just the birth of drones. It's, in many ways, has its roots, or at least a birthplace, in California.
Yeah, it's armed drones, very much a California invention. The inventor of the Predator is an Israeli-American called Abe Karam, who still lives here in the state. Karam was originally working with Israel Aerospace, which was one of the pioneers of drones, moved over to California in the 70s. And at the same time that Apple and Microsoft were starting up in garages, he had a drone startup in his garage down in Los Angeles. The company that ended up taking over Karam's design, General Atomics, is still there down in San Diego and still has the monopoly on armed drones. So California very much at the heart of this new industry, very much part of it. The Predator really didn't emerge until the early 90s, and it wasn't weaponized until 3 days into George Bush's presidency. So it really is a weapon of the war on terror. You know, of any single weapon for this conflict, you could say that the armed drone is that weapon.
But it didn't get its start that way. I mean, the idea of the Predator, and it wasn't. I mean, it was actually another company, two brothers, the Blue Brothers.
It's the Blue Brothers who run General Atomics, which actually make them. They were the ones who, so Abe Karam's company, I mean, he came up with this brilliant design. The Navy was very excited, and then the Cold War ended, everything dried up, and Karam's company went bust. But the CIA and Pentagon loved the design, and they were determined to save Kerem's project. It was then called the Gnat, not the Predator that we now know.
It doesn't sound quite as intimidating.
It doesn't sound quite as intimidating. And as I understand it, this company, General Atomics, run by these maverick brothers who were a little bit crazy, involved in some interesting work in Nicaragua. They had been toying with the idea of creating these drones which had explosives in the nose that they could fire at Sandinista forces, and then deniability around that. Their story is in the book, and they're absolutely fascinating. They all seem to be on the edges of various CIA operations. And the Blue Brothers are talked into taking the Abe Kerem's project on board. And they develop it quite rapidly, actually, into what's initially just an unarmed vehicle, which proves very, very good in places like Serbia at seeing what the enemy is doing. And slowly the Air Force, the CIA start to see the value of this. But the weaponizing of the Predator came very late. And it came about directly out of a plan to assassinate Osama bin Laden prior to 9/11. The CIA had found bin Laden at a place near Kandahar. The problem was they were looking at him with a Predator. The images were being fed back to the United States. We have to think back to how war was before drones, actually, because back then, even when they were looking at him in real time, bin Laden, it would still take hours to stand up a cruise missile, get it fired across. It would have to travel, a couple of 1,000 miles and land where bin Laden had been. And somebody came up with the bright idea of, well, if we put a missile on the same aircraft that's looking at him secretly, we can kill him right there and then. So the weaponizing of the Predator came about through a plan to assassinate Osama bin Laden. And all of the secret planning around that was sort of moving towards that point before 9/11, when, of course, events interceded.
And that, literally, they were planning just before. They had plans in place.
Yeah.
Just days before, weeks before?
There was a meeting of what's called the principals at the White House, which is the Secretary of Defense, head of CIA, and so on. I think 5 days before 9/11, they finally agreed to begin properly weaponizing the Predator. But counter to that, there was a report from one of the auditors at the Pentagon who looked at this weaponized Predator and said it was rubbish. So that it landed its missiles far too wide of the target. There were major problems with it, and suggested it go back to the drawing board. History, of course, intervened. And what happened was almost immediately after 9/11, the very few Predators that they had, the Air Force and the CIA, they were crated up and shipped out to the region. So instead of the usual years-long trial of a weapon system that we would usually get, Predator was tried in the field immediately after 9/11 and proved to be very good. Very bad on occasion in terms of getting it wrong, but in terms of the accuracy and precision and so on, it proved to be a very effective weapon.
So obviously with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and U.S. military personnel coming home and dealing with, in Afghanistan, the longest U.S. war ever, and with it, improvements in medical treatment. So we have many more people alive who have come from the battlefield dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, having been on the battlefield. How does that translate to being a drone pilot? What's it like being a drone pilot?
It was fascinating when you talk to the operators. I managed to get quite a lot to talk to me. They're a very closed and tight community. They are uncomfortable talking about what they do. But I did manage to get around a dozen, mostly special forces drone pilots and operators to talk to me for the book. In terms of post-traumatic stress, that was fascinating. The levels of PTSD among drone operators is actually lower than in the regular US population. So PTSD among the US population is around 5%. Among drone operators, it's about 4%. But what the Air Force quite quickly found is that PTSD wasn't the problem. They were seeing a whole new cluster of psychological problems manifesting in the operators, in the pilots, in the intelligence analysts. And in fact, one senior Air Force psychologist told me that they're working on a whole new definition, which they're calling, I think, remote warfare combat stress, because the PTSD simply doesn't fit the model. Some of the trauma was coming from what the operators were seeing. They were very empathetically connected sometimes to the people that they were killing, because they were watching them for days, weeks, even months before they killed them. Sometimes operators would have to sit by passively and watch atrocities committed in real time and be powerless to act on them. And I was told one really shocking story about a young lieutenant on her first shift as a drone pilot. And unfortunately, the operation she happened to be monitoring involved a gentleman being taken out of a vehicle and killed in a very graphic way, which I won't go into, but it's in the book. She had a breakdown that night. They had to call in the cleric that was attached to the drone squadron, and she never flew again. So often operators quite traumatized by the things they experience. The stresses that were bolted on around that turned out to be much worse. So if you're a regular Air Force pilot flying a combat aircraft, you will go to the front line for 6 months, you will do combat, then you come home, usually for a year. The drone operators were doing 3-4 year stints with no break, 50 weeks a year, 2 weeks holiday a year, 12-hour shifts a day. Very, very intense working conditions, no downtime. And the one plus that the Air Force thought there would be there, which was that they got to go home to their loved ones at the end of the day, turned out to be the worst thing at all. Because the operators weren't able to decompress. They were bottling it up. You don't want to go home and tell your husband or your wife that you've spent all day killing someone or seeing these atrocities. You're not going to bring that up with the kids at the dinner table. So in fact, the operators were internalizing all of this, and it damaged them quite badly, some of them. And fascinatingly for me, what we now have, most drone squadrons now have psychologists on call 24/7. So just as frontline troops have combat medics, drone squadrons now have psychologists. And I think that's a reflection of the differences of this kind of warfare. And I think the big takeaway for me for the book was that, the idea that these drone operators belong to some PlayStation mentality, that they are cold and distanced from the people they're killing. It could not be further from the truth. I found all of them to be very honourable and to take the business of killing very seriously indeed. And unfortunately, some of them have been quite messed up by that process.
So at this point, let me do this. We've received a number of questions from our audience that I'd like to bring in for our conversation. The first one comes from someone with the Mountain View Academy. Who determines who the drone pilots, the operators and the targeters, who determines who they should kill? And what are the criteria for being assassinated or killed by a drone?
Who gets killed really depends on who the customer is. So if it's and that's what they call it, the customer. So if you're on the regular battlefield, it will be a forward air controller or a local military commander will call in a strike on a particular location. It might be a base is under attack by the Taliban. It might be a targeted killing of an individual who's deemed to need removing from the battlefield, because targeted killings happen on the regular battlefield as well. Special forces, as I say, often their focus is intelligence gathering. Killings have been less common. But the other side of special forces, and a major part of the CIA, is targeted killings, the assassinations. And for those, there is a process. People are put on kill lists. They go through a process. If they have enough points next to their name, they go on the kill list. There used to be something called Terror Tuesdays, which were run out of Washington, which was where the different agencies would come together and a lot of them confer, and they would decide who would go on the list and less commonly who would come off the list. So it is a process. It is a killing machine that the United States has built. And just in the secret strikes, we think 3,000 people have been targeted and killed in that way. And I would guess overall, if we can extrapolate from that onto the regular battlefield, we're probably looking at around 15,000 people killed so far with drones by the United States.
So with that, well, when we step back for a second, you talked about targeted killings. Maybe we can just have a definition period of our conversation. What's a targeted killing versus a signature killing?
I think a targeted killing, as I understand it, is a designated individual or individuals. We know their identity. We know what the allegations are against them. We know where they are, and they are killed to order, if you like. There is an order put out. They will be killed. They are taken out. Over time, we got the emergence of something else on the battlefield, which was called the signature strike, and they're much more controversial. When JSOC was working in Iraq, it was getting in so much data on what was going on below that they had a breakthrough in terms of intelligence gathering, which became known as pattern of life analysis. This vast quantity of information coming through that allowed them to start predicting certain patterns of behavior of the people they were observing. Now, for JSOC, that was predominantly about intelligence gathering. The CIA took that information and turned it into a predictive method of killing people. So they would look at patterns of behavior of people in the tribal areas of Pakistan, for example, and if they behaved in manners conducive to behaviors associated with the Taliban or Al-Qaeda, they would often be killed. And we often saw quite devastating strikes against large groups of individuals in places like Pakistan that sometimes went very badly wrong indeed. And one of the worst cases was when a group of tribal elders were gathered in a village called Datakel in 2011, actually to discuss a mining dispute in the local mine. The CIA misinterpreted that gathering and believed they were acting in a manner consistent with Al-Qaeda, as they later put it. And they dropped 2 Hellfire missiles onto that gathering and killed 42 people. That's a signature strike. And they are problematic as we understand it. Obama ordered that they be significantly reined back because of exactly that kind of problem. They didn't know who they were killing a lot of the time.
So that segues into what exactly is bug splat?
Yeah. Bug splat is a really interesting one. There are these terms that have got into the Air Force's language. One really ugly one is squirter. If you've heard that, a squirter is someone who runs from a vehicle or from the site of an initial strike, and then you go and kill them anyway. We'd heard this term bug splat and had been led to believe that a bug splat describes the aftermath of a drone strike. It's like when a bug hits your windshield. In fact, it turned out to be a bit different from that, and I was walked through by a senior intel person what bug splat actually meant. And it's in fact this very complex modeling software that they use with the drones to predict when and where and how civilian casualties might occur. And they use that modeling very carefully, I'm told, to make sure that the drones, when they strike, cause the least damage. So they'll come in from different vectors. And basically anything in red means everyone in that zone will die. Everything in amber means half will die, and everything in green means it's okay. So bug splat is, as I understand it, this predictive piece of software, and it is this idea of the vast quantity of information being pulled off the battlefield now. And I use a figure in the book, which is, I think, in the first 24 years of the Hubble telescope, the amount of information gathered on the entire universe by the Hubble telescope, that amount of data is pulled off the American battlefield every 2 days now. Colossal amounts of data now that are involved. And some of that data can be put to good use. The more we know about our enemies, the higher the quality of the images we're looking at, the higher the quality of the data hacks that we're doing, the less likely we're going to be to kill civilians, is the thinking.
So with this, the idea or the concern of the legality of these kinds of targeted or signature strikes, and with U.S. really recruiting its allies. I mean, certainly a number of countries that have had their own experiences with terrorism, or some of the 9/11 terrorists who had been in different cells in Germany and elsewhere. With that in mind, and with that intelligence sharing that goes on, what is the European Union's concern and some of the U.S. allies' concern when it comes to drone strikes?
I think it's very straightforward. It's legality. As I say, for almost every nation on the planet, the targeted killing outside of the hot battlefield is seen as unlawful. nations may not publicly criticize the US, but privately that is a concern. And there's some very interesting choices going on at the moment. I'm often asked, what about Russia? What about China? Right now, Russia and China are getting more out of criticizing the US for its policy than actually mimicking what the US has done so far. So, for example, when the United Nations began its investigation into US, Israeli, and UK drone strikes, that was partly at the instigation of the Chinese and Russian governments, which so far have chosen not to adopt this kind of targeted killing. And in fact, China played a little game a couple of years ago. It leaked a story through its own state newspaper. There was a very appalling incident a couple of years back where a drugs gang, which was intercepted by a Chinese inshore naval boat, the gang butchered 17 Chinese sailors and then went on the run. And China was in pursuit of these men. China found the men in the so-called Golden Triangle between Thailand and Cambodia. China had by then developed its own armed drone capability, but China leaked the fact that it had considered whether to use a drone strike to kill these men, but since that was unlawful, it decided it would not do that, and it then worked with local authorities to arrest these individuals, who were then brought to trial in Beijing and executed. And I thought that was a really interesting bit of troublemaking by the Chinese. They were basically saying, yeah, we have your capability. We just think that what you're doing is unlawful. And by the way, we killed them anyway. We just did it with due process. So there are concerns out there. I think the challenge is going to be that if other nations start their own targeted killing program, that the US has in effect written the rule book, and it's a problematic rule book.
So stepping back for a second, with the fact that we're talking, and the president and a number of other people have talked about drone strikes, but these are all supposed to be classified secret activity. So how is it that these things are brought to light, and where do you look for this information?
That's a really good question. I ask a lot of annoying questions constantly. Some of the information is available. Some of it you can tease out. As I say, it was great to be able to talk about how special forces had used drones. That was a story that hadn't been out there until the book. That took a lot of patience and persuasion. It's a very tight community. One of the commanders, the first special forces commanders, it took me 8 months to convince him to talk to me on the record, and I'm very glad he did. The CIA stuff, to their credit, and it really is to their credit, I did not get a single CIA pilot, operator, or analyst to talk to me, and I never have. I suspect I never will. Their secrecy is extraordinary. They don't blag, they don't brag. That tends to come from the politicians and from the high ups at the CIA. A lot of the information leaks out at the sides, Mike Morrell, the former acting head of the CIA, has got a book out at the moment, and that book is boasting about his successes at the CIA. It's also a program that he's not supposed to talk about, but he's the ex-deputy, acting head of the CIA, so he can talk about it. So we get bits here, we get bits there, and sometimes the president's forced to go on the record and discuss things. So our understanding is limited, it's partial. And I think if the CIA were to publish what really happened with the drone strikes tomorrow, it would radically change our understanding of the drone wars. I don't doubt that for a moment. Often you hear the CIA criticize, we hear that they don't know who they've been killing. I suspect they know a heck of a lot more about who they've been killing than we do. They're just not telling us. So there's an awful lot more information that we could learn that we're not privy to at the moment.
Part of it is it is so murky in terms of in these areas that are where many of these strikes have occurred, these secret strikes too. These are lawless areas. There isn't a lot of government control, a lot of government involvement. And when there are these strikes, there is very much a secondary battle, and that is over information. And what kind of disinformation is put out there. The secrecy of the CIA versus there is a strike, there are casualties, there are deaths, but oftentimes those who the government is trying to kill might be trying to limit the figures or numbers of the people that have died that are their colleagues or their comrades?
It's a criticism that's often out there that the civilian casualty numbers are propaganda and so on. And my usual counter to that is, well, then explain to me why we've had 2 civilian deaths reported in Pakistan in the last 2.5 years, and it needed the CIA to tell us that they'd actually killed them. And those were unfortunately the 2 civilians we learnt about just the other week. I've not detected much evidence of different actors, state and non-state actors, trying to manipulate casualty data out of places like Pakistan. The reporting's reasonable. And it's difficult, but it's not impossible. There are reporters on the ground. International agencies do get in there. NGOs do get in there. And I think we have a reasonably good idea of who the CIA has killed in places like Pakistan. It's not complete, but I think, for example, that the estimates of civilians killed in Pakistan has coalesced now at around 400 civilians killed over the last 9 years. That estimate includes, for example, I managed to obtain a secret document the Pakistan government had been keeping all along, where it had been logging civilians killed in the CIA drone strike. So there's a sort of public consensus around 400 deaths. The problem is the CIA position is that they've killed no more than 50 or 60 civilians. And there is this gulf between public and agency estimates, and it's an irreconcilable gulf right now. My view, and it's very much there in the book, is I think to some degree the CIA has gerrymandered the numbers, that many of the people we would consider to be clearly civilian non-combatants, women and children, for example, have somehow been disappeared from the numbers. The CIA's estimates simply aren't credible when measured against the public record. But as I say, if the CIA wants to publish who it's killed and share that with us, we will work with that and we'll measure it against our own understanding. And John Brennan said 2 years ago, the CIA's director, he wanted to publish details of civilian casualties, and we're still waiting.
So do you have any sense moving forward with this renewed debate about the transparency, accountability, and the overall use of drone strikes, particularly off the hot battlefield? Do you think that may also reignite a shift in policy, where we may ultimately see more fighter pilots, more bomber pilots, and less of a focus, say, on drones?
I don't think we'll move away from the drone anytime soon, simply because it's so much more precise. And we want the most precise weapon on the battlefield. Anything that reduces risk to civilians, if we're going to conduct war, is a good thing in my view. I think the challenge going forward is about efficacy. Even if the US disregards challenges around morality and legality, we come back time and time again to efficacy. And are they effective at what we say they're doing? And I think there's a genuine decision point coming up for the next president. You know, just as Obama, when he came in 2009, had a choice. You know, he ditched torture, he ditched extraordinary rendition. He said he was going to close Guantanamo. He didn't drop the drone strikes. He kept the drone strikes, I think because they were too tempting. I think the next president coming in has a similar choice. Are the benefits of armed drone use in the secret wars now outweighed by the negatives? And that whether they'll be able to make that choice in peace, I don't know. Whether the public pressure to keep the drone strikes going, whether it will be portrayed as a sort of weakness to let the drone strikes go, that's a different matter. But if they're judging it purely pragmatically, I think that's a very realistic choice. One high-ranking former US intelligence official told me that they always thought at CIA that there was going to be a limit to these targeted killings. There was going to be a window in which America could kill its enemies effectively before what he called the second and third order effects kicked in. The second order effects were described to me as when America's allies, it became too much of a problem that the killing was going on. The third order effects was that America was killing fewer enemies than it was creating with the drone strikes. And from my conversations with a lot of military and intelligence officials, some feel that that threshold was passed quite a long time ago. So the efficacy of the drones, whatever it was, may no longer be there. But that's an assessment, I guess, for a new president to make.
So it's been a killing tool for us and a recruitment tool for our enemies.
I think that's a fair point. And you can't necessarily pin that on the drones or all on the drones, but the State Department's own analysis, as I say, is that Al-Qaeda in Yemen, for example, is 10 times stronger today than it was in 2011 when the drone strikes began. That doesn't seem to be a particularly effective tool then, if Al-Qaeda is stronger, not weaker.
So this next question may be more fitting for the FAA, but we'll ask you anyway. How does the controversy around the military drone program impede development of drone use in other areas, such as environmental monitoring, search and rescue missions, other, say, scientific research, journalism?
That's a great question. I mean, 99% of the drones out there are non-militarized, and we talk about a revolution in drone warfare. There's a revolution in drones going on, and the potential is extraordinary. I mean, who knows where this is going to go? It does represent challenges, however, and I think, for example, the FAA's concerns around drone use are less around the militarization of drones and more about concerns, for example, around terrorism. I think threats to the homeland are not going to come from the big strategic drones. They're going to come from tactical drones that you can pick up at your local store, slave to your iPad, and something now called swarm technology. That's the danger, and I think that's what officials are concerned about. But I think that will get dealt with. I think the revolution that remotely operated equipment, as opposed to remotely piloted aircraft, represents is extraordinary. And has quite staggering potential going forward. We are so often, when I talk to the people involved in the military's drone program, they talk about this being the point just after the Wright brothers first got in the air. That's how early on we are in the drone project at the moment, and nobody really can predict where this is going to go.
I mean, have you talked to any futurists, or have you taken on that role yourself in terms of artificial intelligence, or what other?
I did talk to quite a few folk at the Pentagon about artificial intelligence. There's a big resistance to that in the military, probably just for job reasons, actually. But the view is, the view is they always want a human in the loop. They don't want autonomous weapon systems, and I don't think any of us should, actually. I think autonomous weapon systems are unbelievably dangerous as a concept, and there is a lot of pressure going on at the UN at the moment to simply ban them outright right now before they ever get off the ground. Where the interesting pressures are going on around drone warfare at the moment is not, it's automating a lot of functions. So because you've got all of this information coming in, can you run algorithms, for example, that deal with 95% of the data before it's ever seen by an operator? That's a slightly different debate, and I think that will happen. It has to happen, because on current projections, the Air Force has calculated that the amount of data it's scooping up is so exponential at the moment that they'll need 200,000 intelligence analysts by the end of this decade. I mean, it's clearly never going to happen. So I think the other question is sort of what the next iteration of armed drones is going to be. What we can call the Predator and the Reaper, if you like, first generation. The next generation of armed drones might have to defeat enemy air defenses. They might need to be supersonic. They might need to have very big bombs on them to achieve the same effects that very small bombs are having at the moment. 10 years from now, we might actually look back quite fondly on this period as a time when we could control drones, when they were limiting the risk to civilians. The next generation, we may lose all of those advantages, and they may simply be the equivalent of the manned aircraft we have today, but without pilots.
So what part of the Pentagon and the Department of Defense is really driving this? Again, these programs are all essentially Air Force programs, but where the Navy pilots? Where's the Army?
They are all developing their own programs. So the Army has the Grey Eagle program, for example. That's its own drone system. The Navy is involved in everything from carrier-launched fighter pilots to submarine drones. I mean, the entire military is engaging with drones at the moment. It's I don't think there's any one kind of drones are driving the whole thing. It's just diffused throughout the military now.
So stepping back to the question of the legality for a second, we're talking about utilizing drone strikes to go after, on one hand, our enemies. And certainly there is an issue of, do we actually know who we're going after, whether it's going after an individual or going after behavior. But in a war context, I mean, is there, to help maybe flesh out a little bit more to distinguish the issues of legality on a battlefield versus off the battlefield? I think there's still some question there.
The regular battlefield is pretty tightly regulated. The laws of war are clear, by the way. You are not prevented from killing civilians on the battlefield. We try and mitigate the killing of civilians, but you are lawfully allowed to kill civilians in war. That's the reality. The laws of war have simply evolved over the decades to limit and restrict and try and reduce as much as possible. But war is war and civilians die. The complication becomes, what is the battlefield today? Where is the battlefield today? Many of the wars that we're fighting are not how we've been brought up to classically think of a war against two competing armies of nation states. They're often in almost post-conflict environments where militants, insurgents might live among civilian populations. The Red Cross wrestled with this a couple of years ago and slightly changed its definition and created the concept of what it calls the civilian combatant. That's quite hard for me to get my head around, the idea of a civilian combatant, but I think that's a fair representation of what we're sometimes seeing on the battlefield. If someone's not in uniform, if they're an irregular in a militant organization, but they're also living with their family, what do we class them as? So that's why you'll often hear me refer to civilian non-combatant. It's a much more precise term. The US's assertion, and it's a very clear one, is that the battlefield does extend beyond the hot bit to those places where Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and other enemies are, and that it does have a right to take the war to them. As I say, that is very hotly contested by others. There is significant resistance to the idea of extending the battlefield as we understand it away from the pointy end of the military stick, if you like.
So we have time for just one more question, and that really is another kind of crystal ball question for you. And that is coming full circle with this renewed debate. Do you foresee any consequences at all? Anyone being held accountable for these civilian deaths as a result of these secret strikes?
I really doubt, unfortunately, that we will see accountability. I describe an incident in the book. Back in 2006, there was a bombing at a place called Chenagai in Pakistan, which led to the deaths of 81 people. I describe it in some detail in the book. I've got a lot of new witnesses and a lot of plausible evidence to suggest that this was a CIA operation. 81 people died. 69 of them were children. 69. Absolutely shocking event. In 9 years, no US official has ever stood up and said it was us, it wasn't us. The damage that event continues to do in that local environment is profound because no one's taken ownership for it. And I did finally get to put this to a high-ranking former US intelligence official and said, was it the CIA? And they said, it could have been us. And then they kind of dodged the question after that point. And I find that remarkable that it takes 9 years to nail down an official, and that's the best you can get out of them. And I think so often the problem with these strikes is you can argue that the US has been doing a very straightforward job in terms of tackling terrorism, but by removing itself from having to account for when things go wrong, it's also been damaging the US's reputation. It's been damaging what the US has actually been trying to achieve. If by refusing to apologize to the parents of those 69 children, you've tripled recruitment in that area, you know, you led to more attacks against the US over the border or whatever, what have you actually achieved? Well, you know, and who at the CIA, if they did carry out that strike, who took responsibility for the killing of the kids those days? The answer is probably no one.
Well, and that's a great point for us to leave with. That's all the time we have for tonight. On behalf of the World Affairs Council, please join me in thanking Chris Woods for this excellent discussion. Many thanks to you as well, the audience, for your great questions. As a reminder, Chris's latest book, Sudden Justice, is on sale courtesy of Books, Inc., and he will be available to sign copies. Good night and thank you.